Well, thank you so much, Bernardo, for making this appearance with us. Your ideas are fascinating, and I look forward to exploring them with you. Why don't we start from a very basic level, because you are talking about idealism, and idealism in philosophy is different from the way the term is used in ordinary language. So could you tell us a little bit about idealism and idealism as you define it?
So the word idealism should actually be ideaism, because it's the notion that all reality is made of ideas, not ideals. But ideaism didn't catch, so we all use idealism now. It doesn't mean ethical idealism, the idea that we pursue our ideals in life. No, it's the notion that reality is fundamentally mental. It's of the same kind as ideas, and not necessarily in your mind alone or my mind alone, or only in the minds of living beings. No, there is an extended transpersonal kind of mind, that's the postulate, whose activity presents itself to us as what we call the physical world. So the world is essentially mental. It just presents itself to the screen of perception as what we call matter and fields and physicality in general.
Well, one thing that your theory seems to encompass is a concept called panpsychism, which is the idea that this consciousness, this mental quality is inherent in everything. Is that the case? And if so, could you go into that a little bit?
It's not the case unless you use the term panpsychism in a very broad, relatively loose way. Panpsychism is the idea that everything has mind. Idealism is the notion that everything is mind instead of has mind. So under panpsychism, all matter has mind, has experience as a fundamental property of it. Under idealism, matter is an image in mind. There is no such substrate fundamentally outside and independent of mentality. What we call matter is just a presentation in mind of transpersonal or even personal mental processes. To get an intuition about it, if you see yourself in front of the mirror while you're very sad and crying, the thing in itself which exists is your sadness. It's the thing you feel from within. That's the immediate given. And the tears that you see on the mirror and the contorted facial muscles, those are the extrinsic appearance of the sadness. It's the way the sadness presents itself on the screen of perception. And that's what we call matter, an image, a representation. It doesn't have standalone existence under idealism. It is just an image of a mental process. In this case, your sadness. In the case of the inanimate universe, the mental processes unfolding in a transpersonal mind at large. But in all cases, matter doesn't have standalone existence. It's just an image. That's idealism. For panpsychism, matter does have standalone existence, and it does have physical properties like mass, charge, momentum, spin, and so forth. But in addition to all those fundamental physical properties, it also has experiential properties. So under panpsychism, everything is minded. Under idealism, everything is mind.
Well, I think one obstacle for many people who would hear this theory at the beginning would be that they tend to equate mind with something like human consciousness. But your theory obviously speaks of mind in a much more comprehensive sense. Could you go into that point a little bit?
I speak of mind in the technical sense that we call phenomenal consciousness. In that sense, for something to be minded, there has only to be experience. There doesn't have to be higher level mental functions such as self-reflection, metacognition, the ability to introspect, the ability to think about one's own thoughts, the ability to carve out the world into cognitive entities that we call objects. None of that is needed. All that is needed for us to speak of mind is that there be experience. Any experience, it doesn't matter what, it doesn't matter how simple. So under this understanding, what idealists will say is that there is indeed an objective world beyond our individual minds, but that objective world, which is objective by virtue of not being in our individual minds, is itself also mental in the sense that it has experiences of some sort, probably a lot simpler experiences than our metacognitive mental landscape, our higher level mental functions, but they are experiential things nonetheless, things that are felt, experienced in some sense.
In an 1890 interview, Thomas Edison said something like this: look at all these atoms. They interact with each other in all sorts of ways and create various different substances. Do you mean to tell me that they do this without some kind of consciousness? Does that view resemble yours, reflect yours at all?
The thing is, we tend to think in very dualistic terms because of our history in the West. We tend to think in terms of mind and matter as two somehow different things that relate to one another in some sense. What idealism says, and also strict physicalism, by the way, is that there are no two things. There is only one thing. For the physicalist, there is only matter. And mind doesn't really exist. It's some kind of byproduct illusion of matter, which is, of course, self-evidently absurd, because all we have ultimately is mind. All that we can be directly acquainted with is mind. The idealist bites this bullet and says there is no matter as an entity separate, outside and independent of mind. What we call matter is just an appearance of mental processes, which may not be your own, may not even be another person's. It may be transpersonal mental processes. But matter is not a thing. It's just an image, a representation, an appearance. It's the way certain mental processes present themselves to our observation. So to speak of, atoms and molecules combining, do they do that? Do they do that in the absence of mind? Are they minded when they combine? My answer would be, there are no such things as atoms and molecules that are minded. Atoms and molecules are like the pixels on a screen. And the images on the screen are not things. They don't have standalone existence. They are representations of something else, which is being imaged. So if you see, say, a football match on your television with all those little men running around your screen, that's an image. But you don't think of that image as the thing in itself. There aren't real little men running around inside your television screen. The image is not a thing in itself. The image is a representation. It is an image, an appearance of something else. In the case of the football match, the actual football match happening in a stadium very far away from your home. The images on your screen are not the football match. They are a representation thereof. They are not a thing in itself. They are an extrinsic appearance. So if you apply that same analogy to matter, then you get to the idealist notion of matter. Matter, just like the little man running your television screen, is not a thing in itself. It's a representation, an appearance, an image of something else. And that something else are experience of often a transpersonal character, which present themselves to you on the television screen of your perception as what we call matter. So there is no sense for an idealist in talking about, do atoms combine because they are minded, or do they do that without being minded? It's like asking whether the little man on your screen kicked the ball because he was minded or he was not minded. No, there is no little man in your screen, you understand? The little man on your screen is an image. It's a representation of something else. So what are atoms and molecules combining or drifting apart for an idealist? It's just parts of the image of certain mental processes. Individual or elementary subatomic particles are just the pixels of the screen of perception. And this screen of perception, like your screen, your television screen at home, represents something that is beyond itself. The images on the screen of perception are representations, appearances. They are not the things in themselves. And subatomic particles, elementary subatomic particles, are just the pixels of that image, the smallest indivisible elements of that imagery that forms on the screen of perception. To ask or to wonder whether elementary subatomic particles are things in themselves is like to wonder whether individual pixels on your television are things in themselves. No, they're just segments, the smallest segments of an image. And that image is not a thing in itself either. It's a representation of something else. The football match happening on the stadium far away. If you crack your television open, you're not going to find little colored pixels or a little man running around. Those are all representations, not real standalone existence.
Well, you did say that your philosophy is non-dualistic, but you do, in your answer, speak often of representations of something else. If there's a representation, there must be something represented, so you still have two things. So what are these pixels representations of?
When I talk of dualism, I mean substance dualism. Of course, there are dualisms of every kind, hot and cold, light and dark, fear and love, there are all kinds of dualisms. But what I mean that idealism is not is a substance dualistic philosophy. For idealism, there are no two different kinds of existence, no different kinds of ontic categories, as we say in technical philosophy. So everything is mind, but you can have mental processes that you experience by direct acquaintance, like your own fear, or you can experience those mental processes indirectly through representation in your own mind, like when you see somebody else crying. Then the experience of seeing someone crying is a representation of the sadness that that person feels by direct acquaintance. Both are experiences. My seeing someone crying is an experience. The person feeling sadness is an experience. It so happens that one type of experience, a representation, represents another type of experience, that which is felt by direct acquaintance. Both are experiences, but there is a representational relationship between different kinds of experience.
Okay. Yes, I think I see what you mean. Thank you. Oh, by the way, for just for listeners, the word dualism, like idealism, is used in a number of different ways, both in philosophy and outside of it. So that clarification of what kind of dualism you actually were meaning was very helpful. That sounds good. Well, to go on, idealism has a long tradition in Western philosophy, including Bishop Berkeley, Schopenhauer, and so on. And you're obviously familiar with this tradition. How do your ideas fit into it? How do they jibe with these predecessors? How do they differ?
So Berkeley, he founded the school of subjective idealism, which is a particular formulation of idealism. And what it says is that your experiences of the world are purely in your own mind. They are created by your own mind, and they don't really represent an external state of affairs. It's like your own private dream, and everybody has their own private dream. And somehow, through God, those private dreams seem to be mutually consistent with one another. But they are all dreamed up in the sense that they are all endogenous experiences being sort of generated by your own mind, as opposed to things that represent external states of affairs. Schopenhauer is a representative of the school of objective idealism, which says, no, our perceptual experiences do represent external states of affair, the states of a world outside. It's just that those external states of affair are also mental in nature. They are also experiences, transpersonal experiences that you in turn represent on your own screen of perception as the colors, sounds, and flavors that are all around you. Those representations are qualitatively different from the represented experiences. In other words, the objective experiences, for the lack of a better word, transpersonal experiences of the world outside, the external reality. But although they are qualitatively different, meaning that perceiving the world feels different than being the world. They are qualitatively different, but there is a clear and consistent correlation between these two types of experiences, which allows for us to speak of perception as a experiential representation of external states of affairs, which are themselves also experiential, but of different qualities when experienced directly.
So then, from what I understand, from what you've just been saying, your views would be closer to Schopenhauer's than to Berkeley's.
Absolutely, yeah. Even Berkeley sort of, the famous dilemma that was posed to him, if a tree falls in the forest and there is no one around to see or hear the tree hit the ground, does the tree then actually fall in the forest? And the idea of this criticism, this dilemma that was posed to Berkeley, is to highlight the absurdity of the idea that there are no external states of affairs. And even Berkeley sort of surrendered to that when he said, well, but God experiences the tree falling in the forest. So the mental states of God would then constitute the external states of affair. But he still has the representational problem. How do our experiential perceptual states, the colors we see, for instance, how do they correspond then to the mental states of God? Do they represent them, or are they mutually consistent by mere coincidence? How does that work? And what is the boundary between my mind and the mental states of the world? How does that boundary arise? How can we account for that? This is something Berkeley didn't touch on. As a matter of fact, Schopenhauer hinted on a solution, but also didn't really address the question very explicitly. So it has been left to us now to sort of more directly, with 21st century knowledge and understanding, to address this point of how does this boundary between internal mental states we know by direct acquaintance and external mental states we only know through representation, how does that schism arise? Why does that arise? What is it constituted of?
Very good. Thank you. Well, your ideas seem to be inspired to some degree by the discoveries of quantum physics. And people use quantum physics as almost an excuse for almost any idea at this point. But perhaps you could say how these discoveries relate to your own insights.
The other day, I heard that there is a field called quantum economy, and I was like, what? But anyway, I don't think we need the experimental results from quantum physics to safely adopt idealism as the only plausible metaphysical option on the table today. Reason alone, in terms of internal logical consistency, conceptual parsimony, clarity, these things alone point directly to idealism. It points to physicalism being unnecessarily inflationary, lacking explanatory power, being internally inconsistent, all kinds of things. So that's sufficient. Having said that, we have a bonus, because over the past 40 odd years, since the late 70s, results have accumulated in the field of foundations of physics. You can call it quantum physics to stick to the fashion. These results have accumulated. They have consistently been replicated. Loopholes have been consistently eliminated over the years. And there is tremendous consistency across these results. So now you cannot deny them anymore. It's too much on your face. And what these results show is that you have to make a choice. You have to choose one of two possibilities. Possibility number one: physical realism is false. In other words, physical objects, physical entities do not have standalone reality. They do not have their own existence. They exist by virtue of the fact that something is observed. Physical entities are the result of observation or measurement, which is the better, more accurate word. Before you measure something, it isn't physical. It has none of the physical properties like mass, weight, determined position in space and time, direction of movement, speed of movement, electric charge. None of that, none of the observables, which is a technical term, exist prior to a measurement. There are only fields of potentiality, so to say, potentials, but nothing that has a physical property. And when you measure it, then as a result of that measurement, physical properties arise, which directly indicate that the physical world is not a thing, it's a representation. It's what arises from observation, from measurement. It's literally a representation. And before there is someone to represent it in their own minds, it's not there, because physicality is just a representation. It's like the output on a dial connected to a measurement apparatus. Before you make a measurement, there is nothing on that dial. Nothing shows up. But once you make a measurement, oh, a number comes up on the dial. That number is a physical property. Before you measure, there are no physical properties because there is nothing in the dials. Which doesn't mean that there isn't a world out there that is being measured. Of course there is. There is an objective world out there that is being measured. It's just that this objective world isn't physical, because physicality is the result of measuring that world. It doesn't exist prior to measurement, but the world does exist prior to measurement. So option number one is you have to abandon the idea that physical entities are fundamental. They aren't. They only arise out of observation. What is fundamental is something else that is by definition non-physical. That's option number one. Option number two, and embarrassingly enough, it's the option pursued by renowned people like Sean Carroll, the physicist. Option number two is to say, no, physicality is fundamental. It's just that every infinitesimal fraction of a second, countless gazillions of new, real physical universes pop into existence, for which we have absolutely zero empirical evidence.
Yes.
I mean, take your pick. What's more plausible? There is an objective world. It's one world. It's just not physical. We have to figure out what it is. I would say it's mental, transpersonal mental states. Or there are countless universes arising every fraction of a femtosecond for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. Today, the latter option has acquired a strange sense of plausibility. Something that I think future generations, future psychologists will spend a lot of research grants studying how we could have become so crazy, so lost in theoretical abstraction, so ungrounded from a obvious, clear sense of what's plausible and what's not plausible, so disconnected from empirical evidence in our speculations about the nature of reality. But yeah, that's what we have to live with today. The likes of Sean Carroll come across as very intelligent, very serious, very strict, while they are promoting absolute and total nonsense, fairy tales.
Well, I personally suspect that this has something to do with their consciously or unconsciously cleaving into an attempt at physical realism rather than the first option. But that's very technical. My question then is this. Science has been used over the last 2 centuries to, in a sense, prove or attempt to prove this physical realism. That is to say, the typical person assumes that the scientific worldview asserts and underpins physical realism. And this is a common belief, an assumption. What you're saying is that science is actually proving exactly the opposite.
That's correct.
So how is this insight, once it percolates out, likely to influence the general culture and our sense of reality as a civilization?
I understand your question, because we like to believe that our cultural beliefs are modulated by evidence. And therefore, since now science has, unless you've completely lost your mind, like Sean Carroll and others, science has now proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that physical entities do not have standalone reality. They are not what the world as it is in itself is like. Matter is just how the world presents itself to our measurements, to our observation. This is now, it's a done deal, it's proven. So you would think that given enough time, this empirical proof would percolate through the other sciences and change how doctors go about treating patients, change how psychologists go about talking to patients, how biologists understand life. It would percolate through every nook and cranny of human thought, given enough time. Unfortunately, that's not how things go. And if you look at history, it takes an incredible amount of in-your-face empirical evidence for us to change our belief system, which Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm, a word that has also been abused and misused all over the place. But I mean paradigm in the technical sense that Thomas Kuhn defined it in the 1960s. So what will happen instead for a very long time is the likes of Sean Carroll, they will manufacture plausibility for ideas that in the face of the evidence are absurd. Plausibility will be manufactured through incredible flights of conceptual abstraction, theoretical fancy, that are completely disconnected from the ground of reality, from evidence, from what's in front of our eyes. This has happened all over the place in history, and it's worse now because the quantum revolution happened over 100 years ago, and you have other spokespeople of science, cosmologists, biologists, people like Richard Dawkins. They still talk from a mindset of the late 19th century, and the more you criticize that, the more they seem to sort of dig their heels into their position because they have their entire ego invested in it. And there's an entire segment of the population, the self-pronounced skeptics, who have little to do with true skepticism, but they like this idea that everything is meaningless, that everything is material and lacks all experience. It somehow makes them feel tough and superior to other so-called flaky people. And they would dig their heels in this, and they have a lot of airtime in the media. The culture manufactures plausibility for what is empirically already absurd, known to be absurd. Now, I do have some hope that things will change, but not because of the force of the evidence. Because all these guys, ultimately, they honestly think they care about evidence, but their psychology tricks them. And in fact, they don't care about the evidence. They care about a certain belief system that is deeply ingrained. Those guys will not change their minds. What will happen is that they will be gone and a new generation will come. And if you look at young people, millennials today, they are much more open to the questions. They are much more aware of the doubt that persists, as opposed to already being egoically committed to a solution that is no longer tenable. And when this new generation, when these millennials that are now 20 years old, when they are 40 and they hold the keys of power, the keys of culture, the keys of media, they will be the journalists, they will be the scientists, they will be the doctors, the teachers. When that happens, then we have a chance. That's how paradigms have transitioned throughout history. And we have no reason to believe that it will be any different now. It will happen, but it will take 20 years at least, I think.
Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the aphorism that science advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of this leads us into what would seem to be religious areas. And how do these views, shall we say, impinge upon religious views of the universe, both standard and alternative?
I tend to prefer to leave that to my audience to okay. Connect the dots and see if there is a relationship, although I did write a book about religion, more than allegory. And I can't summarize a book in a couple of minutes, but I would say this. I don't think religious myths, if interpreted literally, hold any water. If interpreted literally, you've killed them. You've defied the meaning that the writers of those myths intended the myths to have, because those myths were written 2,500 years ago or more, and they were written by people who did not have the concept of literal truth. Before Aristotle invented the axioms of logic and the rules of derivation, and Western philosophy sort of took off from there. Before that happened, humans always thought analogically. They thought by similarities. So instead of saying time flows, which is a literal description of the behavior of time, they would say time is a river. They would appeal to a similarity that the listener would have to figure out himself. It's not in the myth. The myth only says time is a river. Now, you shouldn't interpret that literally because, one, it's absurd. Time is not a river, all right? And two, it was not the intended meaning of the cultures that made those pronouncements, because they didn't have the concept of a literal description or literal truth. They thought analogically. They thought metaphorically. Therefore, time is a river. What they're trying to tell you is that time flows like a river. Now, we can parse and decode that by consulting our intuition when we ask the question, what is it about time that is the same in a river? Oh, it's the flow. Right, that's what they meant. So religious myths have to be interpreted in this manner. Now, what is the similarity between what is stated in the myth and the possible nature of reality and mind? You have to make that parsing in order to identify the similarities the writers of the myth were appealing to, and counting on you to consult your own intuition to understand their intended meaning. If you interpret religious myths this way, as I just said, then I think you will find that there are abundant correspondences between religious myths and idealism. The Gospel of John talks about the Word having created the world. The word is a translation of the Greek logos, which means word, but it also means thought, mental activity. So mind created the world, and mind, transpersonal mind, God, the Godhead, incarnated in the figure of Jesus. Jesus's core subjectivity is the same core subjectivity in God or in mind at large, the transpersonal mind that underlies all nature. And that's eminently a technically sound idealist proposition captured with more depth in a religious myth. But to understand that and to be sensitive to that depth, you have to avoid the trap of literalism. Literalism is as damaging to religion as atheism, perhaps more damaging.
Very good. Well, this leads me to another question, which is, I see that in your work you have addressed the metaphysical aspect of the work of C.G. Jung, and I'm wondering if you could discuss that a little bit.
I think Jung was a philosopher. He knew he was a philosopher, but he was understandably concerned with his imago, his image in the scientific community at the time. And then the time he lived was the peak of materialism, the late 19th, early 20th century. That was when materialism completely dominated academia. And if you were not a materialist, then you were completely disregarded and made fun of. Jung was acutely aware of that. So he presented his work sincerely, as it was not a deception. He focused on the scientific empirical aspects of his work. What are the reports of my patients telling me about the nature of mind? That was his approach. And he insisted he was not a philosopher, he was a scientist, until later in his life when he admitted full on, well, okay, I've been doing philosophy for decades, all right, because it's inextricably linked with psychology. You can't separate the two. And if you read his corpus, as I did several times, well, 3 times, maybe 4, he drops hints about the metaphysics that informed his work throughout his corpus. Many, many hints, sometimes elaborate, explicit, direct, unequivocal hints. You find it in his letters. In a letter to Pastor White, one of his friends, he said, "To me, mind is an ousia." And ousia is a Greek word, which is the most unambiguous word you could choose. That's why he didn't choose a German word. He didn't choose an English word. He chose the Greek because it's the only language where this word is 100% unambiguous. Ousia means a substance or a type of thing that has standalone existence, standalone reality. It's not reducible to anything else. It's not explainable in terms of anything else. It has its own standalone existence. That's what ousia means. And Jung said, the mind is a ousia. That's idealism, unambiguous, distilled to its core, right there. For Jung, the collective unconscious was not unconscious in the sense of being phenomenally unconscious. It was unconscious only in the sense of lacking higher order mental functions, like the ability to introspect and metacognize one's own feelings, for instance. So for Jung, the unconscious meant that, not the absence of experience, but the absence of metacognitive experience, a higher level mental function. To be metacognitive of an experience, you need, one, to have the experience, and two, to know that you have the experience. Now, one can exist without the two, but you need the two to report on the experience to your therapist or even to yourself. So what the patient couldn't report for Jung was the unconscious, which doesn't mean that it wasn't experienced, it just was not accessible through introspection in a metacognitive way. So the collective unconscious for Jung was a spatially unbound field of transpersonal experiences which presented themselves to us according to archetypal patterns in the form that we call the material world. And that's why there are synchronicities, because the same archetypes that govern the behavior of our minds, our individual minds, the same archetypes govern the behavior of the material world. Why? Because the material world is just an image which arises through observation, quantum physics back there, an image which arrives through observation of transpersonal mental states, which are also informed and governed by the same archetypes. That's why you can have these meaningful coincidences between a personal mental state and a material event in the world out there, because the world out there is just the material representation of the collective unconscious, which is psychic, mental, experiential in nature.
From my understanding of Jung's work, he seems to have been heavily influenced by Kant, and he seems at various points in his work to correlate his archetypes with the Kantian concept of categories. That is to say, these archetypes are, in a sense, patterns or categories by which we apprehend the world. Is that your understanding?
Not quite. No, I see that there can be a relation, but I think Jung's archetypes would correspond much more directly with Plato's forms, which is the origin of the word archetype, by the way, that primordial prototype of all experiences which follow being imperfect copies or reproductions of that primordial original experience, or the archetype in itself. Jung also insisted that the archetypes are empty, in the sense that all you can experience are the way you clothe an archetype with images. But the archetypes themselves are abstract patterns, just like and Jung used this example, the crystalline structure of a diamond. That structure exists whether there is a diamond or not, because you know that if a diamond grows, it will grow according to that structure. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So there is a sense in which the structure pre-exists the diamond because it's enforced by the laws of physics. For Jung, what we call the laws of physics are partial manifestations of archetypes, and archetypes are templates of mental behavior. They are the preferred patterns according to which mind unfolds and behaves or experiences itself. As such, they are akin more to Plato's forms. And that's a point Schopenhauer made. Schopenhauer connected Kant with Plato. And we know that Jung was very impressed by Schopenhauer. He writes about this in his biography. So I think there is, strictly speaking, there is a very good case to be made that the origin of the idea of archetypes in Jungian thought, the prototype of that were Plato's forms through Kant and Schopenhauer.
Very late in his life, Jung seemed to indicate that the simple counting numbers were among the most important archetypes. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's best known and perhaps most accurate pupils, in the sense of that she truly understood Jung, even though she was much younger. She wrote a book about this, but it's a very difficult case to make, and von Franz didn't make the case very well. For Jung, numbers are archetypes of order, and that's why numbers allow us to model the behavior of the physical world so exquisitely accurately, even though numbers and the ways we manipulate numbers are mental things. Mathematics is a mental thing. It's not out there, you would claim, right? Because when you derive the proof for a theorem, you're not looking to the world. You are consulting your own mathematical intuition, which comes across to us as absolutely self-evident and not requiring any proof. Like that 1 + 1 is 2 is self-evident. It doesn't require any proof. That's actually not quite right, because Whitehead and Russell spent 232 pages, I think, to prove that 1 + 1 = 2 in the Principia Mathematica in the early 20th century. So things are not that simple, but we experience logic and mathematics as things that are self-evidently true. If I am equal to you and you are equal to Maria, then I am equal to Maria. You know, these are logical theorems that don't seem to require any proof. And when Jung equated numbers and the whole edifice of mathematics around it, and logic, which underlies the edifice of mathematics, when he equated all that to archetypes, that was an attempt to explain why mathematics feels so self-evident to us, because it reflects the patterns of our own thinking, the archetypes according to which our own thinking unfolds. So numbers reflect archetypes, archetypes of order. And it's not then surprising under idealism that if that is so, if numbers are our internal mental archetypes, it's not surprising that our mathematical models are so accurate in representing the world outside, because the world outside is also mental and it's operating according to the same archetypes. And that's an explanation for what physicist, what was his name? I forgot his name. He published a paper in 1960 called, I will paraphrase the title, The Uncanny Power of Mathematics to represent the physical world. And he called this power a miracle 12 times in his paper. Eugene Wigner wrote this paper in 1960, and he was flabbergasted with the fact that our own mathematical axioms, the way we think, the things that are self-evident to our minds, turn out to be so accurate in predicting the behavior of galaxies millions of light years away. How is that possible? Wigner asked in his paper. And he called it, again, a miracle, 12 times. Now, under idealism and under Jungian philosophy, the philosophy underlying Jungian psychology, this is not surprising at all, because the world and you are both mental entities governed by the same archetypes. So the archetypes that inform your sense of logic and mathematical axioms are the same archetypes that inform and govern the behavior of the world. Therefore, your models accurately capture the behavior of the world. It's self-evident. It's not a problem.
Very good. Thank you. Well, could you discuss some of the implications of your ideas in regard to the whole area of artificial intelligence, which seems to be such a fascinating issue in present-day thought?
I happen to have a background in artificial intelligence because I'm not only a philosopher, I'm a computer science as well. I have a PhD in both. So I can speak for a long time to this. I think artificial intelligence, even general artificial intelligence, in the sense that a computer will be able to solve every problem a human mind can solve, I think that will happen, and it will not take long. It's not only plausible, it's around the corner. There is nothing in my philosophy that would preclude the notion of a highly intelligent computer, more intelligent than a human being, because we have an objective definition of intelligence as it is used in AI. Intelligence is a way to process data that maximizes the potential for a good solution to a problem. That's intelligence. Intelligence is measurable. We have IQ tests, which are flawed for humans. But we have tests to tell us whether we can distinguish a computer from a human if we engage in a conversation with the computer without knowing that it is a computer. So there are tests for this. It's an objectively measurable property, intelligence. And artificial intelligence will happen at the level of human minds and beyond. But artificial intelligence does not entail or imply artificial consciousness. Intelligence is just clever data processing. Consciousness is when that clever data processing is accompanied by experience. The fact that there is clever data processing does not require that it be accompanied by experience. And that's a mistake often made in the AI community. People think that if you create an intelligent computer, it's also conscious in the same sense that you and I are, in the sense of having private conscious experiences, private conscious in their life. I would say we have absolutely zero logical or empirical evidence to think that a silicon computer can have private conscious in their life. At least we don't have any more evidence to believe that than we have evidence to believe that this metal bottle has private conscious in their life. By the way, the metal bottle doesn't even exist. The physical world is a continuum of fields. Carving out the inanimate physical world into separate objects is something we do out of convenience. It's arbitrary. Where does the river end and the ocean begin? This bottle is surrounded by air. It's atoms of one kind here, atoms of another kind around it. It's a continuum of fields, because those atoms themselves are made of elementary subatomic particles, which are themselves just excitations of spatially unbound quantum fields, 17 of them in the last count. So there aren't even separate physical objects. There is no such a thing as a computer. So how, as distinct from the rest of the inanimate universe, we carve out the computer for convenience so we can use one and talk about it and sell one and give it to one another. But we are just moving chunks of the inanimate universe as a whole when we do that. So if we can't even speak of a computer in and of itself as a standalone subset of the physical inanimate world, how can we speak of it having its own inner life? It's not even there to begin with. It makes no sense to speak of it as having its own inner life. The only empirical example of private conscious inner life we know are living beings, because we are that. And we know that we are conscious, and we know that we metabolize, and we know that there are other things out there that also metabolize, just like us. They do protein folding, transcription, mitosis, they burn ATP, all those nice things that are called metabolism, and which only living beings have. Other living beings have that too. So we have good reason to think they too have private conscious in their life in the way I do, because they are very analogous to us in every other way. They are very analogous to me in every other way. But a silicon computer doesn't metabolize. It's something that's completely different from a metabolizing living organism. We have absolutely no reason to think that the mere fact that it processes information cleverly imbues it with private conscious inner life of its own. It doesn't. To think that it does is equivalent to the following. I can simulate kidney function on my computer accurately down to the molecular level. But that doesn't mean that my computer will pee on my desk, because the simulation of a phenomenon is not the phenomenon. It isn't that obvious. Kidney function simulated on my computer will not pee on my desk like a real kidney would. But when it comes to intelligence, we make precisely this mistake. We think if we get a computer to simulate the patterns of information processing in our brains, we think that the computer will have private conscious in a life of its own, that the computer will pee on its desk. It's an amazing departure from a sense of plausibility we have just about everywhere else. Now, why that? Why this psychological phenomenon? Why do we part with plausibility when it comes to consciousness? It's because consciousness is so fundamentally unexplainable under materialism or physicalism that it becomes a great mystery. And if it is a mystery, you can say anything you want about it. It's equally implausible, if you know what I mean. So that's why we have this madness of artificial consciousness going on in the culture today. It's ridiculous.
Very good. Could you just end by giving the viewer some idea of where to go to explore your ideas further?
You can come to my website, bernardokastrup.com. One word, Kastrup with a K. It's not Kastrup, it's Kastrup. In the US, this sounds like a Spanish name, but no, it's a Danish name, actually. And there are links to everything in there. You can also go to essentiafoundation.org. It's the foundation I lead that promotes idealism, and we have hours of free online courses explaining idealism in all detail. That we have just published a course that is more than 6 hours long, and it's completely free on YouTube. You don't even need to register. And we go into much more depth about the subjects I covered here. And from my website, there are links to my books, to my social media presence, my essays, theses, and all kinds of things.
If you had one of your books to recommend to a reader as an introduction, which one would you pick?
I would actually recommend the one that has come out right now, today or yesterday, Science Ideated. And the reason is it's constituted of short essays that are very to the point. And that's a good introduction because it sort of gives you an opportunity to dip your toes into the territory in a way that is compelling and opens your mind, but without going into a long and profound argument that needs attention, needs hours of your time. Dip your toes, because each of those essays attempts to show to you that there are here, there, and there different but extremely compelling reasons that you can explain, like in the drop of a hat, for us to abandon materialism and think about the nature as fundamentally mental. So that's a good introduction. Science Ideated.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. This has really been delightful, fascinating. This has been an hour packed with fascinating ideas, and your mind is obviously packed with fascinating ideas. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
I do too. Thanks for having me here, Richard. It's been a pleasure.